The sharp, violent crack of dry-rotted cedar snapping under pressure echoed over the low hum of the Chicago suburbs. I dropped my framing square onto the tailgate of my truck and turned just in time to see the lower left section of my neighbor's front porch sag by 3 inches. A cloud of fine, gray dust puffed out from beneath the lattice. Nobody screamed, but the silence that followed was heavy with the specific kind of dread that comes with sudden property damage. I crossed the property line between my driveway and hers, my heavy work boots crunching on the dry grass. I didn't know Aurora Evans well. She was 36, an illustrator who kept weird hours, and she inherited the aging Victorian next door a year ago. I spent my days building custom mahogany staircases for clients who cared more about the optics of the wood than the craft holding it together. Coming home to the quiet deterioration of my own neighborhood usually just made me tired. But seeing the front corner of her house dip toward the earth pulled a different reflex out of me. The structural integrity was failing in real time. I jogged up the concrete walkway. Aurora was frozen on the top step, her hand gripping the white wooden railing so hard her knuckles were stripped of color. She stared down at the collapsed floorboard near her boots, her breathing shallow and fast. She didn't look hurt, just entirely defeated. I stepped onto the lowest tread, testing the weight distribution. The stringers were soft, spongy with years of neglected water damage. I kept my voice low, aiming for the kind of steady rhythm I used when my apprentices panicked on a job site. "Don't shift your weight to the left," I told her, pointing to the bowing joist beneath the decking. "The cantilever is compromised. Walk straight down the center line to me." She blinked, pulling her focus away from the splintered wood to my face. She took a slow, deliberate breath and walked down the center of the steps. I didn't reach out to grab her. I just stood, anchored at the bottom, providing a visual blockade until her boots hit the solid concrete of the walkway. "I just paid off the plumbing," she said. Her voice lacked any dramatic pitch. It was just a flat, exhausted statement of fact. She dragged a hand through her red hair, letting out a long exhale that seemed to deflate her posture. "I dropped a box of books on the deck and the whole thing just surrendered. It's not your fault. The end grain wasn't sealed when they built it," I said, crouching down to inspect the damage. I ran my thumb over the sheared edge of the wood. It crumbled like stale bread. Moisture got trapped behind the fascia. It's been dying for a decade. I stood up and wiped the dust on my work pants. "I have some temporary bracing in my truck. I can shore it up so the roofline doesn't drag." "You don't have to do that, Theo," she said, wrapping her arms around her ribs. She looked away, staring at the manicured lawns of our neighbors. "I'll call someone. Eventually. If you leave it unsupported overnight, the torque will crack your second-story windows," I stated, keeping it factual. I didn't ask again. I walked back to my truck, pulled a pair of heavy-duty adjustable steel shores from the bed, and grabbed my impact driver. By the time I returned, she was sitting on the concrete retaining wall, watching me with a mix of gratitude and overwhelming fatigue. I wedged the steel braces under the main carrying beam, ratcheting them tight until the porch lifted a fraction of an inch with a protesting groan. The immediate danger was neutralized. I stepped back, feeling a small, practical satisfaction in the stability I had just forced back into the structure. A crisp, high-pitched voice sliced through the evening air before Aurora could speak. "Miss Evans, I see the deterioration has finally reached critical mass." I turned to see Mrs. Gable, the president of the Homeowners Association, marching down the sidewalk with a clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. She wore a pristine beige trench coat, her eyes scanning the cracked wood and my steel shores with calculated disapproval. Aurora stood up instantly, her posture stiffening. "It's a localized break, Mrs. Gable," Aurora said, her voice tighter now. "Theo is just securing it." "Securing it with industrial scaffolding is not in compliance with the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines," Mrs. Gable replied, stopping at the edge of the lawn. She didn't look at me. She pulled a pre-printed yellow notice from her clipboard and held it out. The board has received multiple complaints about the state of this exterior. You are officially on notice. You have 30 days to bring the entire porch structure up to code, or the daily fines will commence. And given the safety hazard, those fines will be steep. Aurora took the paper, her fingers trembling slightly. 30 days? I need to source materials, find a contractor. 30 days, Mrs. Gable interrupted, tapping the face of her watch. The aesthetic integrity of the community affects all our property values. Good evening. She pivoted sharply and marched away. Aurora stared at the yellow paper. The paper wasn't just a fine, it was a threat to her ownership. I recognized the look on her face. It was the quiet panic of someone doing the math in their head and realizing the numbers wouldn't ever add up. I packed up my impact driver, keeping my movements deliberate and slow, giving her a moment to process without an audience. 2 days later, the evening air was warm, carrying the distinct scent of ozone that promised a late summer rainstorm. I was standing on her walkway, leaning against the bottom post of the railing I had braced. I wore my usual olive green t-shirt dusted with sawdust from my shop. The porch lights flickered on, casting a golden, steady glow over the gray siding of her house. Aurora stepped out the front door, letting the screen door click shut behind her. She wore a yellow-ribbed tank top and light blue jeans, a small, dark tattoo visible on her wrist as she rested her forearms on the white wooden railing. The soft lighting caught the copper tones in her hair. She looked less panicked today, but the exhaustion was still embedded in the corners of her eyes. "I have a plan," she announced, looking down at me. "A plan for the porch?" I asked, crossing my arms. "A plan for my life," she corrected, a dry, self-deprecating smile pulling at her mouth. "I am going to find a rich husband. Or at least a husband who owns a roofing company. It's the only logical financial strategy left." She leaned a little further over the railing. "You're a guy. You know things." How do I write a dating profile that says, "I am a successful artist, but currently financially crippled by a century-old house," without sounding like a liability? I stared at her. The joke was meant to be light, a defense mechanism to deflect the humiliation of the HOA notice. But standing there, looking up at her under the amber porch light, the casual humor didn't land for me. I noticed the way she nervously picked at a chip of paint on the railing. I noticed the tension in her shoulders that never entirely went away. I felt a sudden, sharp drop in my stomach, a realization that the idea of her going on dates to fix a problem of survival bothered me more than it should. I kept my face perfectly neutral, dropping my hands into the pockets of my work pants to prevent myself from reaching out to stop her from picking at the paint. "You don't need dating advice," I said, my voice coming out quieter, more grounded than I intended. "I really do, Theo. I haven't been on a date since I moved here. I don't even know what the market looks like." She offered a small, forced laugh. "Come on, give me a strategy." I looked at the rotting wood of the joist beside my boot, then back up to her face. I didn't want to engage in a hypothetical conversation about other men sitting on this porch. I wanted to fix the floorboards. I pulled my hands out of my pockets and leaned closer to the railing, closing the physical distance just enough to make the conversation private. "I asked my neighbor for dating advice," she mused, shaking her head. "This is a new low. Why not just date me?" The words left my mouth before I could filter them through logic. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was sudden and absolute, like a vacuum sealing around the porch. Aurora stopped picking at the paint. She looked at me, her eyes searching my face for the punchline. When she realized I wasn't smiling, her breath hitched, a tiny, barely audible intake of air. "Theo, I'm 36. You're, 28? She said carefully, testing the boundary of the conversation. "I have a mortgage I can't pay, and a house that is actively trying to crush me." You build staircases for millionaires. We are not on the same timeline." "I didn't ask for your timeline. I asked a question," I replied, keeping my tone entirely steady. I didn't push forward. I stayed anchored on the bottom step, giving her the high ground, letting her control the space. Before she could form a rebuttal, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Diego, my lead crewman, texting me about a materials delivery for the morning. The intrusion broke the quiet tension. Aurora looked away, wrapping her arms around herself. "I appreciate the neighborly distraction, Theo, truly. But I have to figure out how to satisfy the HOA before Mrs. Gable puts a lien on this place." She turned to go back inside. "Wait!" I stepped up one tread. "The dating thing was a distraction, I know that, but the porch isn't. I'm a licensed general contractor. I have access to wholesale lumber and an account at the structural steel yard." I looked at the yellow notice still taped to our window. "I can rebuild the deck frame and the load-bearing columns. We do it at cost. You pay for the materials, I provide the labor." She turned back, her defensive posture returning. "No, I am not a charity case. I can't accept thousands of dollars in free labor from you just because my house is falling apart." The unworthiness complex flared up, sharp and bright. She hated feeling incapable. She hated needing rescue. "It's not charity. It's a trade," I negotiated, forcing my voice into a flat professional cadence. "You feed me dinner while we work. You assist with the site prep and the cleanup. I need a place to stage my tools overnight anyway instead of hauling them back to the shop." It was a weak excuse, but I delivered it with enough authority to make it sound plausible. "I pull the permit under my license. We start Saturday. Deal?" She looked at the failing wood, then at me. The practical reality of the threat outweighed her pride. She nodded once, a slow, reluctant acceptance. "Deal." Saturday morning brought oppressive humidity. I arrived at 6 a.m. with Diego, who helped me unload the heavy timbers from the flatbed. Diego was 50, a master finisher with a quiet demeanor and a sharp eye. He took one look at Aurora, who was already on the lawn wearing heavy work gloves and dragging debris toward the dumpster I had ordered, and then looked at me. He didn't say a word, but he patted my shoulder twice before grabbing his reciprocating saw. I spent the next 4 hours entirely focused on the geometry of the problem. We needed to remove the compromised cantilever and replace it with a structurally sound, load-bearing span. I moved under the porch, the air thick with dust and the smell of old earth. I set up my plumb bob, checking the true vertical alignment of the existing masonry piers. They were slightly shifted, but solid. I used a hydraulic jack to lift the main carrying beam just enough to relieve the pressure on the rotted joist hangers. "Hand me the half-inch carriage bolts," I called out from the darkness under the deck. A moment later, Aurora's hand appeared through the gap in the framing, holding the heavy steel bolts. I took them, our thick leather work gloves brushing against each other. I secured the new pressure-treated ledger board to the masonry, driving the anchors in with a heavy hammer drill. The noise was deafening, blocking out the sound of the neighborhood waking up. When I finally crawled out from under the porch, coated in a thick layer of gray dust and sweat, the structure was already infinitely more solid than it had been in a decade. Aurora was standing by my tool chest, pouring ice water from a pitcher into a thermos. She handed it to me as I stood up. I took it, the cold condensation transferring to my palm. She didn't look at the dirt on my face. She looked at the heavy, level beam now holding up the front of her house. The tension in her jaw had visibly loosened. A profound relief washed over her features. She realized, looking at the raw, fresh wood, that the threat of collapse was over. I watched her shoulders drop, the defensive armor she wore slipping away in the presence of a solved problem. I didn't point it out. I just drank the water, the cold grounding me, perfectly content to let the results speak for themselves. Over the next 2 weeks, the routine became our anchor. I worked my commercial jobs during the day, arriving at her house by 5 in the evening. The sound of my saw became a neighborhood metronome. We worked in parallel. I measured and cut. She painted the sealants and managed the hardware staging. The chemistry didn't build through long, intense conversations. It built through proximity and silent coordination. One evening, it started to rain. A sudden, driving downpour that turned the sawdust on the driveway into a thick paste. We were trying to get the heavy moisture barrier stapled over the new joists before the water could soak the substructure. I was moving fast, my boots slipping on the wet grass, pulling the thick plastic sheeting tight. "Staple it there," I directed over the sound of the rain, holding the tension on the plastic. Aurora leaned over, her hair plastered to her neck, and drove the staple gun into the wood with a sharp thwack. We scrambled to cover the remaining exposed lumber, throwing a heavy blue tarp over the pile and securing it with bricks. By the time we finished, we were both soaked through. We retreated to the narrow, dry strip of concrete right against her front door. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in 5 minutes. I watched her shiver, her arms wrapped tightly around her wet tank top. I didn't ask. I pulled off my heavy flannel-lined canvas jacket, which was mostly dry on the inside, and held it out to her. She looked at it, then at me. "Put it on. You're losing heat," I said, my voice steady, offering no room for debate. She took it and slipped her arms into the oversized sleeves. The jacket dwarfed her, the smell of cedar and my laundry detergent instantly surrounding her. I saw her bury her nose slightly into the collar when she thought I wasn't looking. She stopped shivering. I leaned against the brick wall, the cold rain hitting my t-shirt, completely ignoring the chill because the sight of her wrapped in my coat was the most right thing I had seen all year. It was a functional transfer of warmth. I didn't move closer to share body heat. I stayed in my space, letting the jacket do the work, maintaining the boundary because the restraint was how I proved she was safe with me. The midpoint twist arrived on a Tuesday, completely unannounced. I was at my shop finishing a mahogany handrail when my phone rang. It was Aurora. Her voice was thin, pulled tight like a wire about to snap. "Theo, they're here. Mrs. Gable brought the city code inspector. They're demanding to see the engineering permits for the structural alterations." "Don't let them on the porch. I'm 10 minutes away," I said, dropping my orbital sander. I grabbed my leather portfolio containing my licenses, insurance bonds, and the city permits I had pulled and threw my truck into gear. When I pulled up to the curb, Mrs. Gable was standing on the sidewalk with a man in a city-issued polo shirt holding a tablet. Aurora was standing on the top step, her arms crossed, looking incredibly small and cornered. The progress we had made over 2 weeks was suddenly weaponized against her. "Without a licensed structural engineer's sign-off, this is an illegal modification," Mrs. Gable was saying, her voice carrying a sickeningly sweet tone of triumph. "The HOA has the right to demand a stop work order and impose the maximum penalty." I walked up the driveway, my boots heavy and deliberate. I didn't run. I moved with the absolute authority of a man who owned his domain. I stepped between Mrs. Gable and the steps, turning my back to the HOA president to look up at Aurora first. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly, ensuring she had my full attention before I addressed the threat. She exhaled a shaky breath and nodded, her hands dropping to her sides. Only then did I turn to face the inspector. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show anger. I simply opened my portfolio and handed the man a thick stack of stamped documents. "Theo Ortega, General Contractor License Number 448-B, I stated clearly. The permit for the structural repair was filed and approved on the 3rd of the month. The structural load calculations were stamped by my partnered engineering firm on the 5th. You'll find the wind shear and dead load specifications on page 3. The inspector blinked, taking the paperwork. He scrolled through his tablet, cross-referencing my license number. Mrs. Gable craned her neck to see the screen, her frown deepening as the inspector nodded. "Everything looks in order here, Mr. Ortega," the inspector said, handing the papers back. You're overbuilding it, honestly. It's solid. I don't build things twice, I replied, maintaining a flat, professional tone. I looked at Mrs. Gable. The work is permitted, legal, and exceeds code. The stop work order is invalid. We will be finished before the 30-day deadline. Mrs. Gable tightened her grip on her clipboard. The final finish must still match the historical guidelines, she warned weakly, lacking any real ammunition. It will be painted historical dove gray, as required, I said, ending the conversation. I turned back to the porch, dismissing her entirely. The inspector and Mrs. Gable walked away, their leverage completely neutralized by methodical, documented reality. I walked up the steps to Aurora. The immediate threat was gone, but the adrenaline crash hit her hard. She sat down on the top step, burying her face in her hands. I sat down next to her, leaving 6 inches of space between us. I didn't touch her. I just sat there, acting as a physical anchor in the quiet aftermath. I was terrified, she whispered into her hands. I thought they were going to put a lock on the door. This house, it was my grandmother's. It's the only thing I have that belongs to me. I've been so scared of losing it that I haven't slept through the night in months. The vulnerability was absolute. She wasn't asking for pity. She was just sharing the weight. I looked at the side of her face, the fatigue lines around her eyes. I realized then that my desire for her wasn't about wanting to hold her. It was a deep, driving need to build a wall between her and the things that kept her awake. You aren't going to lose it, I said, my voice low and absolute. The structure is sound. The paperwork is bulletproof. The threat is over. She lowered her hands and looked at me. The distance between us felt immense, not because of space, but because of the restraint I was enforcing. I kept my hands resting on my knees. I didn't want to blur the lines of my help with my personal feelings while she was still feeling trapped by her circumstances. She needed a soft landing, a place where she didn't have to be on guard. I provided the stillness. The friction arrived a few days later, just as we were finishing the decking. It was beat 7, the inevitable pushback when safety feels too foreign to trust. We were fitting the final cedar boards. I was cutting. She was measuring. You've missed 3 commercial bids because you've been here every night, she said suddenly, handing me the tape measure. Her tone was sharp, defensive. Diego told me. You're losing money on this, Theo. I stopped the saw. The silence rushed back in. Diego talks too much, I said, setting the tool down. Don't do that. Don't minimize it, she snapped, standing up. I told you I wasn't a charity case. I can't owe you like this. It makes me feel like a child who needs rescuing. I stood up, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my arm. The unworthiness complex was talking, trying to push me away before I could realize she was a burden. I didn't get angry. I recognized the fear. You don't owe me, I said, keeping my voice level. I am here because I choose to be here. I make my own schedule, Aurora. You aren't a project. You are my partner on this job. But why? She demanded, crossing her arms, her eyes bright with frustrated tears she refused to let fall. Why put your license on the line? Why spend your nights dealing with my rotting wood and my HOA problems? I looked at her, realizing that practical actions weren't enough anymore. She needed the verbal confirmation of the boundary I had crossed internally weeks ago. I took one step closer, stopping just outside her personal space. Because the first time I saw you smiling on this porch, before the step broke, it was the only real thing in this neighborhood, I said, choosing the hardest, honest truth. Because I spend my life building things for people who don't care. And I wanted to build something for someone who does. I am not rescuing you, Aurora. I am backing you up. There's a difference. She stared at me, the defensive anger draining out of her, replaced by a stunned, quiet understanding. She realized I wasn't claiming power over her. I was offering my competence as a tool for her to use. She uncrossed her arms, her hands dropping to her sides. The fight left her completely. The climax arrived on the final Friday of the 30-day window. The porch was finished, painted the exact required shade of gray, the structural integrity flawless. The final hurdle was the formal HOA board meeting at the community center, where Mrs. Gable demanded a public review of the modifications before clearing the fines. I didn't offer to go for her. I waited for her to decide. At 6 o'clock, she walked out of her front door wearing a sharp, tailored blazer and the same confidence she had when she first joked about finding a rich husband. Only this time, it wasn't a joke. It was armor. She looked at me, standing by my truck in a clean button-down shirt instead of my work clothes. "Ready?" I asked. "I am," she said. We walked into the community center together. The room was full of neighbors sitting in folding chairs. Mrs. Gable sat at the head table, her clipboard at the ready. Aurora didn't sit in the back. She walked straight to the front row, and I walked beside her, matching her pace, the silent, physical presence indicating we were a united front. When her name was called, Aurora stood up. She didn't look at me for permission. She walked to the podium, placed a pristine white binder on the wood, and opened it. "Members of the board," Aurora began, her voice clear and resonant, completely devoid of the panic she had felt 30 days ago. "Included in this binder are the final, signed-off engineering reports, the closed city permits, and photographic evidence of the structural rebuild of my property. The work was completed by a licensed master carpenter, fully bonded and insured. The aesthetic matches the historical guidelines exactly." Mrs. Gable squinted at the binder. "We still require a guarantee that the substructure will not pose a future hazard." This was the active choice. I stood up from the front row. The room went entirely quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measurable reality of a man who dealt in facts, not opinions. "I am the contractor of record," I stated, looking directly at the board members, bypassing Mrs. Gable entirely. "The substructure is guaranteed by my firm's liability insurance for the next 20 years. Any issues with the integrity of that porch fall on me, legally and financially. The documentation is in the binder. The matter is closed." I placed my professional reputation, my license, and my financial safety net entirely on the line, in public, as a shield for her. It was a calculated sacrifice, an absolute proof of seriousness. I didn't do it to diminish her presentation. I did it to seal the vault she had just built. The board members looked at the paperwork, looked at my steady posture, and murmured among themselves. Mrs. Gable's jaw tightened, but she had no leverage left. Reality had defeated bureaucracy. "The fines are waived," Mrs. Gable muttered, striking her pen through the paper. "The modifications are approved." We walked out of the community center into the cool night air. The street lights buzzed overhead. The tension of the last month evaporated into the dark. Aurora stopped on the sidewalk, turning to face me. The victory wasn't just about the house. It was about the fact that she didn't have to fight alone, and I hadn't taken the victory away from her. "You put a 20-year guarantee on my porch," she said, her voice soft, full of wonder. "I build things to last," I replied simply. She took a step closer. The boundary I had maintained for weeks was finally, clearly, no longer necessary. She reached out, her fingers catching the sleeve of my shirt. It was a functional, grounding touch. She wasn't pulling me in for heat. She was anchoring herself to the stability I offered. "Thank you, Theo," she whispered. I looked down at her, seeing the absolute peace in her eyes. I lifted my hand, my rough, calloused fingers brushing gently against her jawline. It was a request for permission, a silent check. She leaned into my palm, her eyes fluttering shut, a long, shaky exhale leaving her lungs. I leaned down and kissed her. It was exactly one kiss. It wasn't an exploration of desire or a frantic collision of bodies. It adhered entirely to the principle of the arrival. It felt like dropping a heavy anchor into solid bedrock. It was the feeling of a door locking securely against a storm, the finality of a contract signed and sealed. There was no hunger in it, only the profound relief of a wandering journey coming to a quiet, absolute stop. My hand rested on her shoulder, grounding her, transferring the last of my steady calm into her. The world stopped spinning. We were just two people standing under a streetlight, the chaotic noise of the world perfectly blocked out by the stillness of the moment. When we pulled back, she didn't say anything profound. She just smiled, a real, unburdened smile, and slipped her hand into mine. We walked the 2 blocks back to our houses, our fingers intertwined, a practical stabilizer that kept us both grounded. We arrived at her newly built porch. The gray paint was flawless, the white railings gleaming in the amber light. She walked up the steps, her weight testing the wood. Not a single creak. She turned around at the front door, looking down at me on the sidewalk. She pulled a spare brass key from her pocket and held it out. "I know you have your own house next door," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I'd like you to have this. For emergencies, or just for whenever." It was a public choice, a concrete gesture that erased the existential void I had felt for years. I walked up the solid, silent steps, taking the key from her hand. I didn't make a speech, I just slipped it onto my key ring, the metal clicking into place. A practical life upgrade witnessed by the quiet neighborhood. Looking back on it now, I realize something fundamental. Love isn't about holding on tight or finding someone to fix you. It's about knowing they will come back if you let go, and trusting that true partnership means building a foundation so strong that neither of you ever has to fight the storm alone. Real love isn't about drama. It's about consistency, safety, and showing up with your tools when the structure starts to fail. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.